Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you today. We thank you for coming and being a part of this Bible study hour. We're studying on Sunday mornings in this class the Sermon on the Mount. And of course, it is just absolutely packed with information and very practical teaching about how we should be living our lives. Our principal text, of course, is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. So have your Bibles open to Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and that's where we pick up our study. We talked last week about the very famous section where Jesus said, "Be salt and light," in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. And we talked about the fact that Jesus did not come to destroy the old law, but to fulfill it. And so that doesn't mean it's still in force. It means it wasn't going to go out of force until it had accomplished all of its purposes and everything stated in it came true. And we believe that happened, of course. So we talked about that last week, verses 17 through 20. Verse 20 was sort of interesting when he said, "Except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." We talked about that Jesus is saying you just can't go through the motions, which was what the scribes and Pharisees were meticulous to go through the motions, trying to hit every mark perfectly. You've got to do this exactly. But as we read elsewhere, and we talked about last week, their hearts weren't right. It was just an outward performance, and it wasn't coming from the heart. And Jesus basically said you got to do both. It's got to be right, but it's got to be from the heart. And that's the challenge for us, is that as we go about serving God, we can't just be outwardly going through the motions. We got to do the right thing, but do it sincerely from the heart. All right, so that gets us to verse 21. In chapter 5, at verse 21, Jesus begins a section throughout the end of chapter 5 in which he says, "Ye have heard, or it has been said, but I say unto you." So he's going to contrast what his teachings and requirements would be with what the common application of the Pharisees. He sort of introduced that in verse 20 when he said, "Your righteousness has got to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees." And really the next long passage is he's going to be actually describing how the Pharisees went about their religious practice. And he's going to be contrasting what he is teaching and requiring to what the scribes and Pharisees were practicing. Now, our author in our questions ask somewhat about this, and you never know what is in the mind of someone who writes these questions, but I want to make sure we understand that as Jesus is teaching here on the Sermon on the Mount, he is going to be contrasting what's right with what the Pharisees were doing. But some people have taken the position, and I'm suspicious that maybe our author of these questions has taken the position that Jesus was just explaining the law of Moses. That this was not new law, this was not gospel, this was not the gospel of the kingdom. This was just an expose on the Pharisees' failed application of the law of Moses, and that the things taught here don't really apply to us because they were just a sort of an expounding upon and an explanation of the law of Moses. Some people have taken that view, and I think it's a very dangerous view, because it basically, it's been argued a lot, and among our brethren, even in recent years, has been argued. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John belong to the Old Testament, and we don't read anything that applies to us until Jesus died on the cross. And so these teachings, interesting as they may be, actually don't even apply to us because they are a part of the old law. There's Jesus explaining the old law. And I just think that's wrong. And you may even like to write in your margin a couple of references that I think prove otherwise. We can go back earlier here, just the previous chapter of Matthew 4. Look at Matthew 4, verse 23. Matthew 4:23. Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. You see that? Was he just expounding upon the law of Moses? No. It says he was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. Look in Luke chapter 16. verse 16. In Luke 16, verse 16, well, actually, if you start earlier, you see that Jesus is the one who is speaking. Verse 15, he said to them, ye are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knoweth your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is abominable in the sight of God. The law, verse 16 is the key. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God is preached, and every man presseth into it. So I don't know how you get around the notion. And some people are pretty adamant about it. Actually, it really comes to play when we get to talking about divorce and remarriage. We're going to, even in chapter 5 here of Matthew, we're going to read something about divorce and remarriage. And so, especially people who have some pet theory about divorce and remarriage, they want to exclude what Jesus said. Well, that was just an expounding or an explanation of the law of Moses. That doesn't apply to us. It does apply to us, right? Jesus was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. We're in the kingdom. This gospel applies to us. So certainly he is condemning and contrasting the Pharisees' flawed application of God's law. But he's telling us things that we've got to adhere to too. Jacob.
So in this passage, there's nothing here that wouldn't be harmonious with the Old Testament and
Right.
in this passage. Other places it's different, but this passage, where it does seem to be really contrasting what they were doing to what they should have been doing. There's nothing that
There's nothing, it applies to us. That's the main point. I mean, I don't want us, and it applied to them too. I mean, because most of what he's going to be saying is you should be doing better than what you're doing. And we'll see here in a minute. He said, we'll see in the very next section when he says calling someone a fool. And we'll talk about that. And so they were trying to look for technical loopholes, how they could do things and not be condemned. And he's going to be on them about that. But I think it's very important for us to stress that what Jesus taught applies to us. It's not just an expounding on the law of Moses. Tom?
Well, Jesus talked to Mary as well. He also talked about, the concepts that are in there. She had a concept that we could work in one place, and Jesus had a concept that we could work in one place else. Jesus said, time comes when, you only worship in this not Lord, you'll be worshiping in spirit and truth. And a number of things that Jesus talks about in this passage is that contrast against the physical law and that spiritual law that was he was trying, was basically trying to get them to, acknowledge. And we'll see that the concept of, with, murder and anger and all these things that he goes through contrast one with the other in the next few passages.
Yeah. Now, Tom brought up something I want us also to talk about, because I know that sometimes we hear people say this, and I don't think it's entirely accurate either. The Old Testament, the law of Moses, was an outward physical law. You just had to bang, bang, bang. You had to do the right things in the right way. And sometimes people try to say, well, Old Testament law was about physical performance. New Testament law is about service from the heart. And I don't think that's necessarily an accurate breakdown. Go to Deuteronomy, check, because our author asked, I'm at question F, actually, under the section that's called Law and Murder, Adultery, Marriage, and Oaths. I'm in that section of our study guide. Under question 1, part F, he talks about the idea that some people have that the Old Testament was just a law, a physical law, and the New Testament is a more of a spiritual law. But look at Deuteronomy. He references Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. This was true of the old law too. Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. Well, Jesus repeated that too, didn't he? When he was asked what's the greatest commandment of the law, Jesus would repeat that. But notice that the Jews, under the law of Moses, were expected to be serving from the heart too. And so it wasn't just an outward law. It was to come from the heart too. There's more. I would not argue that there's more emphasis on our hearts in the New Testament, but under the old law, It was expected to be service from the heart as well. Tom?
Even in, worship and serving God today, a lot of people just, well, as long as I feel good, and I'm doing it from the heart, it's okay. But you can't separate the one from the other. And so, in one aspect, you had over the Old Testament, you had those Pharisees and things that were just doing the letter of the law, boom, 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 boom. But we move over here, we've got a whole host of people in this world today that just want to do the spiritual or just the thought aspect of it. But if they do the physical aspect of it, that's not a problem.
Yeah, you hear people say silly things like, I love the Lord, I just don't go to church. Like they can separate those two things.
And you can't.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Jesus is trying to do here in this passage.
Yeah. Wait.
One thing that I find intriguing is that when God commands us to do something, He uses two methods to try to bring us to Him. One is love, one is fear. They're both from the heart, if I'm not mistaken. I was studying the language recently, and when I brought up 1 Thessalonians about those who are not obedient, will, I can't remember how it says, but something about those who do not obey the Lord will receive fire and vengeance or something like that. But she cut the study off because she said, I'm not about that. I'm about love. But here in Deuteronomy, in that same chapter that you just mentioned, in verse 24, it says, "So the Lord commanded us to observe all the statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all the commandments of the Lord our God, just as He commanded." He uses fear, but fear is from the heart just as much love is from the heart.
That's right. That's right. Exactly right. All right. So let's dive into this section where Jesus says, "You have heard, but I tell you." Let's start at verse 21. We're in Matthew 5, verse 21. "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire." So the way you read that is that Jesus understood that the Pharisees' application was you can do anything up to just short of murder. You can be angry. You can call your brother vile names. Just don't kill him. You can have a horrible attitude toward this other guy. Just don't kill him. It was pretty much the way that they were applying it. Jesus said that even to be angry without a cause. I think that's key there. Verse 22, "I say to you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment." Even that statement implies that sometimes there's reason to be angry. I've got a note in my margin of Mark 3, verse 5. Mark 3, verse 5, "When Jesus had looked round about upon them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, He said to them," and so forth. Jesus was angry, but it was with a cause, right? So the key there is not you can't be angry. The key is you can't be angry without a cause and start calling him names. So Pharisees' application, and it wasn't true, right? It wasn't true at all. But their application is you can have a horrible, hateful, miserable, mean-spirited attitude. Just don't kill the guy. Just don't kill him. Jesus said, I'm telling you, if you're even angry without a cause, it's wrong. Our author asks us, is it possible that we sometimes apply this teaching? We apply what Jesus said almost like the Pharisees would. So, I don't know about you, but I was taught from as long as I can remember as a little kid, do not use the word fool. Do not call someone a fool, because Jesus said, if you call someone a fool, you'll be in danger of hellfire. And so we were always warned adamantly, don't call someone a fool. Jesus said, don't do that. And so I never have. But maybe we could call him a moron, an idiot. He's an imbecile. But I wouldn't use the word fool because that's the taboo. You see how we might be trying to technically act like the Pharisees. You can call him anything you want, but don't use that word. Don't use the word fool. You can use any other word that's the exact equivalent of a fool, but don't say fool. I think it's possible we might be treading on the same ground. Tom?
Some of the concepts here in the New Testament too. It talks about, a fool in his heart says there's no God. So basically, if you're calling somebody a fool, that God isn't anywhere in their heart. And here he's talking to the Jews who believed they were the people of God. So really, calling somebody a fool has had a different connotation than what we have. We might call somebody a fool just somebody that's a bumble idiot that just doesn't know how to get out of their own way. Or somebody that's putting on a front. We use the word fools. No, it's something there to fool us. So sometimes the word, or English word fool, is not what Jesus is using in here in that concept.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts, Jacob?
The Greek word is moros. There is where we get our morons.
Yeah.
And we do have to be careful about not just the word, but what are we saying? What's our attitude about as we're saying?
Yeah, I think that's right.
We cut you off in traffic.
You moron, and then we get and it's the same thing. Dale?
Think back to Moses when he struck the rock. He was angry at him. He called him rebels to his water. But he didn't do what God said first thing, but his anger, I think, is why.
Yeah, and he didn't give God the glory for producing the water.
He would have probably if he hadn't been angry.
He was provoked, and when we're provoked is when we've got to pay special attention to our heart when we get provoked. Wade?
I wonder if we can basically call attention to their actions. Like, that's foolish, what you did.
Yeah.
Not that you're a fool, but that was, what you did was foolish.
Yeah. And I think that's. I don't think that. And again, you got to judge your heart. I mean, why am I saying it? How I'm saying it? But I don't think that Jesus here is just saying this one word is taboo. Don't ever say this word or any form of this word. He's saying, what's our attitude? Monty.
I think sometimes we're trained in that swallowing camel, and I think the word food here isn't what he's talking about as much as the attitude of heart that you're having towards somebody. And as I was reading through this, I was thinking, he starts out talking about not murdering. It seems like he says, if you're angry, or if the word rocker here is basically empty-headed or food. It seems like he's going in a descending order here. Food here, I think, is probably leads to the things he was talking about here. But anyway, he's talking about your attitude about people, and we shouldn't be the type of people that's name callers or downcast on other people. We ought to be trying to build people up, not being insulting.
Okay, I think that's right. I got to tell you though, and I'm not going to use the word fool anyway. even if it, if Jesus is not saying that the word is technically forbidden, I can never bring myself to use that word. But I do think what we're really stressing here is I'm just as guilty if I get mad and call the guy who cut me off in traffic an idiot or a moron. I need to watch that, right? So it's attitude of heart that he's stressing here. But again, notice the contrast. The Pharisees had said, just don't kill the guy. I mean, you do what you want, but don't kill the guy. And Jesus said, no, I'm telling you, have a right attitude toward the guy. Which is, would you agree with that's a way higher bar than just don't kill him? It's a way higher requirement. And so Jesus is calling us to a higher level, taking us to a higher plane. And that's really important for us to understand that. I know I've told you before about one of our first trips to Russia. we were having lectures on the university campus, and a bunch of college students were in attendance. And one of the preachers in our group took a section up aside, and his lessons were on the Sermon on the Mount. Along in the course of the study, as they'd gotten well into the study about the Sermon on the Mount, he just asked these Russian college students who had been brought up as atheists. I mean, it was the official doctrine of the Soviet Union that children in schools were actually taught atheism. They weren't left to draw that conclusion themselves. They were taught to be atheists. But well into the study of the Sermon on the Mount, he asked them, what do you think the world would be like if people lived like Jesus was teaching in this sermon? And they said that without any prompting, they said, it would be wonderful. It would be wonderful. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we didn't get angry without a cause? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we weren't quick to blow up in rage and call someone an idiot or a moron or a fool? I mean, you see this over and over again here in this sermon, but Jesus is calling us that higher plane, and it's really where we need to be. Tom.
Going back to Cain and Abel, it has some bearing in here because, Cain had some issues against his brother, and they built to the point to where he actually murdered him, which, but there were stages in between there that led up to that. And Jesus is going back to the very first step, in that.
And really, if I watch my attitude, I'll never even get close to killing the guy. All right, so as you're saying, he's saying as Barney used to say, nip it in the bud. If you start having a bad attitude toward the guy, clean that up right there. You won't have to worry about this far extreme of murder. I agree. All right. The author asked, what beatitudes would motivate a person to be reconciled to his brother before bringing his gift? Let's read 23 and 24. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. All right, we use these verses a lot, but make sure we understand the scenario. I'm going to come, in this case, they were offering their sacrifices. For me, I'm coming to offer my worship. And I remember that my brother has aught against me. So I am the guilty offender. I have done him wrong. What am I to do? Don't offer the gift yet. Don't try to make that sacrifice. Don't give your worship yet. What do you do first? Go thy way, first be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. So this, and elsewhere, we know we compare this to other passages which talk from the other side of this scenario. If I'm the wronged brother, I should go to the one who wronged me. That's another consideration. This scenario is I'm the offender. I did wrong. And I'm trying to worship, but I realize, I remember, I did that guy wrong, and he's upset with me, and we are alienated. I did him wrong. Go to him and reconcile that. So I thought it was kind of interesting that our author asked us, what of the Beatitudes would make me want to do that? Remember, at the start of chapter 5, we went through that list of the Beatitudes. Which of the Beatitudes would motivate me to say, I got to get right with my brother. I want to be right with my brother. I did him wrong. I want to make it right. I want to correct that. What would be the Beatitudes that would prompt that? Anybody? Being a peacemaker, okay. Jay?
Your heart would be one of them. You want to make sure that you have the right attitude towards them, and you can worship God correctly through your heart.
Okay, pure of heart. All right. Anybody else? Mourning. Absolutely. Right. Mourning. I want to be hunger and thirst for righteousness. I want to be right, and I can't get right if I've wronged my brother and haven't corrected it, I can't be righteous. So, there's so many of those beatitudes that apply here in this matter. I think you'll agree. I think that's interesting. Now, so sometimes we make a break right there, 23 and 24, but our author indicates, and I think it's the right way to look at it, 25 and 26 apply to this idea of I've been alienated from my brother, so I need to go and reconcile with him. And he says, 25, agree with thine adversary quickly while thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. I think those verses go with this, with the previous two. I think 25 and 26 go with the idea of be reconciled. You've done wrong, be reconciled. And he's just giving, in that regard, in regards to being reconciled with a brother that I have offended, he's saying, don't put that off. Agree with thine adversary quickly, because what he's saying is, if I don't, this thing can escalate, and the consequences of it can be worse and get worse and worse. So I want to reconcile with him. It's necessary for so many reasons, and one of the reasons is to avoid an escalation of the matter and consequences that could get worse and worse if I don't. So I think that's a very practical connection to this idea of be reconciled. If I've done him wrong, I should be anxious. If I'm the offender, if I'm the one who's done wrong, then I don't need to make it right. And that as we were saying, the Beatitudes apply to that. You know, poor in spirit, the humility, mourning my sins, those who mourn, hungering and thirsting for righteousness. I mean, so many of the Beatitudes would tell me, I want to get on this. There's no reason for me to delay this. I wronged that guy. I want to make it right. And anything that would keep me from doing that would be a problem with the heart that I shouldn't have anyway. So, any other thoughts through 26? Bobby?
You know, Paul said in Romans chapter 9 about verse 28, 29, and 30, that his brethren sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. And in Galatians chapter 3, verse 12, he wrote, the law is not of faith.
Okay, all right. That may go to the idea we were saying earlier that the Pharisees were trying to do just an outward form of service and not inwardly. All right, so a couple of very familiar verses to us, 27, 28. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. I thought it was kind of almost amusing that our author asked us, could that verse 27 be a quote from the Old Testament? If so, where? That's one of the 10 Commandments, right? Yeah, it is definitely a quote from the Old Testament. Exodus 20, verse 14, thou shalt not commit adultery. I mean, it definitely is a quote from the Old Testament. And then he says, how would the Pharisees misuse this? Well, I suppose the idea of again, the Pharisees would have suggested, maybe, I guess they did. Jesus seems to say they did. You can do anything up to committing the actual physical act of adultery. You can think evil, you can lust, you can covet your neighbor's wife, you can possibly, I don't know how you can engage in physical activity just short of actual sexual intimacy. Just don't commit adultery. You can do anything else. If they did do that, they were wrong, right? Because the principle that Jesus teaches here is that it's not just the physical act, which is obviously wrong, but it's also the thought of heart, which would be wrong. If you look on a woman to lust after, you committed adultery with her already in your heart. Jesus said it's not just the doing of the act, it's the thought that leads to the act. But I'm going to tell you, again, I don't think that was something brand new, never heard of before. Look at a couple of Old Testament passages. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 25. Proverbs 6:25. Lust not after her beauty in thine heart, neither let her take thee with her eyelids. You get the idea that the instruction there was control your thoughts, right? Or how about the famous statement of Job? And Job is possibly one of the oldest books, maybe the oldest book in the Old Testament. We think Job probably was a contemporary of Abraham or lived in that time frame way back. Job 31:1. Job 31:1, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? You get the idea that in Old Testament times they understood you got to be careful about what you're thinking. Not just the physical act of adultery, but you be careful how you're looking upon a woman and thinking about a woman. So again, Jesus is saying that the Pharisees have not got it right. And I'm telling you, you're going to have to do better than that. Your righteousness is going to have to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. But actually, they should have known better too. Because the principle, thus stated, was known by people of old. Way back to Job in the patriarchal age. Made a covenant with my eyes. Why should I look upon a maid? In the Mosaic age, in the book of Proverbs, don't lust after her. So this is not new teaching. This is just stuff that they had overlooked as they were just going about to try and technically be obedient, but from the heart they were not. He asks again, what principle, what beatitude principles would prohibit someone from looking and lusting? Well, again, a lot of them. I guess the one I listed primarily is I want to hunger and thirst after righteousness. I'm craving to be right with God. If I'm craving righteousness, then I'm going to control my thoughts, and I'm going to try to keep my eyes from looking upon a woman in a way to lust after her. Of course, that's a bigger challenge in our day and time than it ever has been because of media. Because media makes it so easy to sinfully lust after others. And so it certainly is an important thing for us. Jesus said, and then you know the next couple of verses. In the next couple of verses, Jesus said, this is how important this is. This is how important this is. Verse 29, if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. I think probably there Jesus has dealt with both things, both the eye, which would be linked to the thinking of evil, and the hand, which would be linked to the doing of evil. Whatever it is, if you're looking at things you shouldn't look at, or if you're doing things you shouldn't do, get rid of that. Was Jesus teaching here bodily mutilation? I've heard critics say, that Christianity business is just bogus because, look at that. Jesus is teaching, mutilate your body. Mutilate your body. Jab your eyes out. Cut your hand off. I don't have any use for that. That's crazy talk. What do you think? Was he actually teaching it, Tom?
I don't think any of us have these spontaneous things of our hands doing something that we don't tell it to do. And our eyes don't look at things that we don't tell it to look at. So, the concept that Jesus is going by, going back to what controls those issues and correct that issue. Otherwise, you cut off your right hand, you don't think your left hand's going to do it? pluck out
Or you're-
one eye, you know, maybe get rid of both eyes, you can't look, but that doesn't concept the things that are already burned in your mind.
Yeah, this is a figure of speech. This is what we call hyperbole. This is the figure of speech known as hyperbole, which is stating a principle in an extreme way for emphasis. And so this is all this is. This is not to be taken literally. This is a figure of speech called hyperbole. But basically Jesus is saying, go to all extreme to avoid looking and lusting and acting upon lust. Go to all extreme. Dale?
He's just pointing out the seriousness of it. He's trying to get across to us, I think, you know, how bad it
Yeah.
is.
And we do the same thing. We use exaggerated figures of speech to emphasize things. You know, I've told you 1,000,000 times not to do that. Well, I haven't told you 1,000,000 times, but I'm just saying I've told you a lot. I've told you a bunch of times, don't do that. And that's what Jesus is. This is hyperbole. This is just intended for emphasis. And the emphasis is do whatever's necessary to keep from lusting and sinning. Right? Tom?
You know, the Roman and Greek cultures have implemented and influenced Judea at this time, you know, significantly. And those cultures, you know, promoted that kind of lifestyle in France. And Jesus, you know, trying to remind them, you know, God said this. And the other concept that we have realized that Jesus, as God, was there when God, you know, when those sons were done. He was the one that probably spoke to Moses and gave that instruction to Moses. If there was anybody that knew what he meant by the laws of the code, it was Jesus.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Pharisees could go through and elaborate on what they thought and things, but Jesus was coming right from the authority of God, saying, here's what God really wants you to do.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Jacob?
He's talking about being willing to do extreme things in order to keep from sinning. A lot of times, we don't even have to do extreme things. We just say, okay, I'm not going to go there anymore. Or I'm not going to do this for entertainment. Or I'm not going to associate with these people.
Yeah, you don't have to cut your hand off, but you...
Yeah. But we're not willing sometimes to even do the simple things.
I'm going to disconnect from the internet because I can't keep from looking at pornography on the internet. I'm going to, oh man, are you kidding? Disconnect from the internet? Are you crazy? I got to have internet, right? No, I don't have to have internet. And if I can't control that, then I need to disconnect from the internet, right? So it doesn't have to be the extreme of cutting your hand off or plucking your eye out, but we might have to do things that people would regard as extreme if it comes to that, and that's what we have to do in order to keep from lusting and sinning. Joel?
I just want to sort of comment about maybe social media. A lot of people get into adulterous situations because of communication, maybe through his girlfriend or whatever, social media. At lectureship yesterday, Spring, the preacher actually said there's anyone here who still hasn't turned off their Facebook. So he thinks that we need to remove ourselves from that because of that temptation. That'd be something that maybe we need to cut off. His bigger point was not the sexual or immoral side, but the distraction and the amount of time it takes from us. But that's clearly what this is talking about. We do whatever it takes to do what's needed.
And I do think that the statement of the Beatitudes, hunger and thirst for righteousness, I desire to be right with God more than I desire to be able to browse the internet on my smartphone. It's more important to me to be right with God than to be able to watch TV and watch all the movies on TV. It's more important for me to be right with God than to be current on all the latest fashion trends. I'm hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Tom?
One of the things that came to Jesus, about was the law of Moses. And we caught this woman in adultery. They knew what the law was, but they didn't follow the law. There were so many things that within that they were more interested in catching Jesus in some kind of thing than really the law that they were, supposedly concerned about. They weren't really concerned about the law. And I think Jesus is trying to illustrate this to them as well in bringing these commandments before them and showing a thought process.
Yeah, what's underlying the action. You know, so Jesus, you understand, go back to chapter 5, verse 1, when this sermon began. Seeing the multitudes, he went up to a mountain. When he was set, his disciples came unto him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, and then the Sermon on the Mount follows. But you got to think that there probably wasn't a big representation of Pharisees in that crowd, right? Out in a country place where the multitudes had come to be around Jesus. But the multitudes knew about how the Pharisees were practicing the law. And so he could say in this section, ye have heard, you know, you're aware that this is the methodology of the Pharisees, but I'm telling you it's not good enough and it won't work, right? All right. Any other thoughts on that? Dale?
Something wants you never give some of these thoughts or, any thought, but the way Jesus expressed them here, it makes a lot of people, really, maybe never looked at it that way. He emphasized it in different ways, different thoughts. So, yes, I think it made a lot of
You got to believe he was really raising eyebrows, don't you? He was raising their eyebrows because he said he's setting the bar high here. We thought the Pharisees were something. We thought they were exceptional. Jesus is asking us to do way more than that. And so you have to believe they're raising their eyebrows. Well, we just got a minute or two left. We're going to stop right there because the next section we need to talk about verses 31 and 32 about divorce. And we'll have quite a bit to say about that, I'm sure. So we'll hold that discussion for next week, Lord willing. Thanks for the good comments.